My name was Myth. In my first life, I was an archaeologist, one whose name became synonymous with discovery, whose hands had brushed centuries of dust from secrets the world had forgotten. Fame came easily once I found my footing, and for a brief, golden stretch of years, I believed I had built something permanent. Then a car accident took everything in a single, indifferent moment. When I opened my eyes again, I was somewhere else entirely. I came into this new world as Medivh, third son of Count Hobarton, whose family was celebrated throughout the region under the title Spear of Hobarton. From the moment I was old enough to sit still, it was clear I had a gift for magic. My father spoke of my future with barely concealed pride. My mother watched me practice and wept from happiness. By 10 years old, both of them were gone. Father fell in battle. Mother followed him into death a season later, grief having eaten through whatever will to live remained in her. The name Hobarton, which had once opened doors and commanded respect, became something people looked away from. The cousins who had envied me began to mock me instead. The relatives who had praised my talent stopped visiting entirely. Only my magic kept me breathing. Those who might have erased the last branch of a weakened bloodline knew, at least, that I could make them regret the attempt. So they left me alone, which suited me perfectly. I spent years in silence. I read. I trained in secret. I waited. When the invitation from Lore Magic Academy finally arrived, I recognized it for what it was, not a gift, but a door. The only one left open to me. The affinity test at Lore Academy was administered in a hall that smelled of chalk and old candle wax. Students were brought forward one at a time to rest their hands on a crystalline orb, which would glow in the color of their elemental calling. Mine glowed black. The examiner's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something uncomfortably close to pity. Necromancy, he said, as though reading a sentence from a verdict. The other students shuffled back slightly, instinctively. Necromancy had been a source of catastrophe once, a disaster of such magnitude that the god of light had sacrificed himself to end it, leaving behind a divine blessing that suppressed necromantic power from spreading further. Since that age, the discipline had been treated not merely as unfashionable, but as cursed. Necromancers were despised, called unlucky at best, dangerous at worst. I couldn't choose what I was born with, so I accepted it. My assigned teacher was a man of roughly average competence who had clearly given up on the notion of legacy students long ago. He taught with the weary efficiency of someone completing a contractual obligation rather than passing on knowledge. When he saw my test results, however, even he went quiet for a moment. My affinity for necromancy vastly exceeded what he'd seen before. He told me, so not with warmth, but with the tone of a man noting that a useful tool was unexpectedly well made. He taught me meditation. He taught me the fundamentals. When I attempted the bone resurrection spell, something unusual happened. I could see fragments of the bone's history, as though time itself was embedded in the marrow, whispering to me about everything the body had once been. I kept that to myself. The spell worked. My teacher called me a genius, mostly because successful resurrection meant he wouldn't have to spend money on training materials himself. The following day, he handed me a scroll and informed me that my formal training was complete. The Necromancer program at Lorne Academy, it turned out, ended at raising skeletons. There was nothing else. The art had dwindled to almost nothing, and my teacher himself was considering retirement. He warned me with something approaching genuine concern that I was walking a road that led nowhere, and suggested, not unkindly, that I might consider becoming a knight instead. I thanked him, completed my paperwork, and left quietly. Returning home was an education in how thoroughly my position had been reduced. My cousins greeted me with theatrical mockery. The genius necromancer had returned, they said, laughing as though the contradiction was the funniest thing they'd heard all season. A year ago, they had envied me. Now, they saw me as proof that misfortune runs in bloodlines. I didn't argue. I'd stopped caring about the Hobarton family the day I buried my mother. Lord Wester, my father's old rival, the man who had spent years engineering our family's decline, summoned me shortly after. He wore his false warmth like a well-tailored coat, and with great ceremony informed me that the noble council had approved a new title for me, Pioneer of the Odyssey region. It was Exile dressed in formal language, and we both knew it. I didn't mind. Leaving the Hobartons behind was precisely what I wanted. When Wester offered guards for my journey, a transparent gesture designed to appear magnanimous while placing his eyes on my movements, I refused. I knew better than to travel with men whose loyalty belonged to someone who wanted me dead. On the day I left, I didn't look back. Let them think I was fleeing in shame. I was heading somewhere far more interesting. The space gate to Jean City deposited me at the border of the known world. From there, it would take 5 days by carriage to reach Winter Fortress, the last landmark before the Odyssey region proper. On the second day, while resting along the road, I heard something shift inside one of my storage boxes. I opened it. Inside, curled around herself in the cramped dark, was Audrey, the very girl whose family had canceled our engagement the week before. She had, apparently, hidden herself in my luggage after drinking a breath-concealing potion, which had rendered her effectively comatose for the duration. She'd been completely defenseless the entire time. I had barely processed this information when a group of bandits attacked. Audrey, emerging from her makeshift hiding place with a sword already in hand, dispatched them with an efficiency that made me reassess my expectations entirely. Afterwards, sitting beside me in the carriage and coughing in embarrassment as she ate dry rations, she explained herself. She had wanted freedom. So had I. Those were the words I'd said to her years ago, when we were children and the engagement had first been announced. My life is my own, and one day I will personally end this arrangement. She had spent years preparing to break it herself before I could, and in doing so had come to understand what I meant. Now her family had stripped her of her noble title and formally expelled her. There was no road back. She decided to come with me. A frail mage, she said, needed a knight's protection. I warned her that the Odyssey region was a wasteland populated by bandits, exiles, and worse. She smiled with the particular determination of someone who has already made up their mind and is only informing you as a courtesy. I didn't argue further. We traveled westward through increasingly empty country. The land past Winter Fortress had a particular quality to it, the silence of a place that had once been loud and was no longer. Ruins broke the skyline at intervals like broken teeth. On our first evening camping among those ruins, I roasted a rabbit over an open fire. The smell attracted bandits out of the darkness, as smells tend to do in the Odyssey region. Their laughter when they saw us was the particular kind that comes from men who have decided the outcome of a confrontation before it begins. I jumped across the fire before Audrey had finished drawing her sword. What the bandits hadn't known? What almost no one knew was that I had spent years of quiet exile preparing for exactly this kind of independence. Long before my father's death, I had gathered resources and trained in secret, cultivating battle energy through methods I'd obtained and practiced alone while my family ignored me. My sword moved with the muscle memory of someone who had made peace with the fact that the world would never simply give him safety. He would have to build it himself. The fight ended quickly. The bandits did not get up. Audrey stared at me for a long moment afterwards, genuinely confused about what she had just witnessed. A necromancer who fought like a trained knight was not part of her understanding of the world. I sat back down and continued roasting the meat. That night, I turned my attention to the buried bones beneath the ruins. Audrey dug while I experimented, testing how my necromancy responded to remains of different ages. What I discovered was remarkable. The older the bones, the more powerful the resonance. Time itself was a kind of fuel. Bones a few decades old glowed gray under my magical perception. A century old, they appeared white. 2 centuries, green. 3 and beyond, a deep and luminous blue. Each age carried not just physical differences, but qualitative ones. The accumulation of years translated directly into strength. I realized, as I worked, that my previous life was not merely a memory. It was a tool, an archaeologist's instinct for the weight of history, the significance of what lies buried. That knowledge had fused with my magic and produce something entirely new. I called it time-bound necromancy. Time was my element. Time was my power. Over the following month, I worked through the night while Audrey trained nearby, and gradually an army took shape around me. White and green skeletal warriors forged from the honored dead of long-forgotten conflicts, each one stronger than the last, each revival feeding my spirit and expanding my understanding of what was possible. The undead I raised didn't need weapons issued to them. Their own bones reshaped into shields and blades and bows through the alchemy of necromantic magic. I drew plans for fortress. Men like Wester still imagined I had died on the road somewhere. They had no idea what was growing in the abandoned lands of the Odyssey region. The smoke from my brick kiln proved to be a recurring invitation. A series of bandit groups discovered the camp in its early days, each arriving with the same misplaced confidence, each making the same mistake of underestimating what they saw. Skeletons, in this era, were considered a joke, the remnants of a dying art, weak enough that a strong farmer could dismantle them. These bandits had never encountered time-forged skeletons before. The first group sent one of their number forward with a wooden stick, publicly refusing to dirty his blade on something so pathetic. The stick connected with a bone shield and went nowhere. The skeleton's return strike put him on the ground before anyone had time to react. The fight that followed was educational for the survivors, of whom there were very few. I returned my attention to the skeleton parts one was assembling. The attack had not interrupted my work by more than a few minutes. Months passed. The camp grew methodically according to plans I'd sketched in careful detail. 100 square block grid, 10 rows by 10 columns, each block 100 meters wide, with the Lord's Castle at the center. Fort warehouses rose along the northern and western edges, their towers and battlements forming the beginnings of a permanent wall. Aerial corridors connected the towers, allowing skeleton archers to cover wide arcs of ground from elevation. During the rainy season, when most forces in the Odyssey region went to ground and waited for the storms to pass, the fishmen came instead. Wave after wave of them, drawn by the smell of blood from the first groups my skeletons destroyed. 2 extraordinary fishmen led the final assault, the most dangerous opponents I had yet faced. The battle was the hardest I'd fought in this world. Audrey held the line while I kept the 2 extraordinary enemies occupied, and somewhere in the chaos of that fight, one of my green-bone warriors pushed past its limits. The energy within it crystallized into something new, bone spirit power, and it stepped across the threshold into the extraordinary ranks. We won. Barely. Audrey had to be carried back to the cabin. When I removed her armor to treat her wounds, the extent of the damage she'd hidden from me was worse than I'd expected. I spent the rest of the night cleaning and binding her injuries with the same methodical care I gave to everything else. When she woke later that day and asked, with perfect composure, whether I intended to take responsibility, I told her to rest and stop imagining things. She laughed softly and closed her eyes. A hunting party from the Givet Federation arrived some weeks later, led by a merchant named Venice who had made his fortune in less reputable trades and had come to the Odyssey region to make more of the same. They had slaves in their wagons, 25 women from various tribal peoples, captured to be sold as luxury goods in the Federation's markets. Venice saw my camp and decided it was a soft target, sending his men forward with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never encountered a properly managed skeleton army. The battle lasted until it didn't. Venice, to his credit, recognized the situation quickly and attempted to buy his way free with money and promises. He knelt and begged with the practiced sincerity of a man who had talked his way out of difficult situations before. I let him believe it was working until it wasn't, then ended the conversation permanently. Dead men carry no stories back to people who want me dead. Audrey dragged back the young nephew, clearly proud of herself. I opened the wagons. The women inside were from 3 tribes: spirit cats, spirit foxes, and spirit rabbits, each with their own traditions and appearance. I had the gray-bone skeletons transport them to an empty warehouse on the western side of the fortress and told Audrey they were not to be harmed. Then I returned to making skeletons. Among the tribal women was one who moved differently than the others. A warrior, clearly, even without a weapon. She watched the camp with assessing eyes rather than terrified ones. Her name was Suong. After 10 days of observation, during which the women concluded with considerable accuracy that any escape attempt would fail and that the camp's inhabitants were largely indifferent to their presence, as long as they caused no trouble, Suong made a decision. She brought Sun, a young woman with a rare gift of mental speech, capable of communicating across language barriers through pure thought, to the door of my brick house and asked to pledge loyalty. I had them wait while I checked with Audrey, then invited them in. Suong demonstrated her abilities. A spirit mark warrior of the cat people, her forehead flickering with an incomplete ancestral rune, extraordinary power gathering beneath her skin in controlled surges. She was calm during my assessment. She had prepared herself mentally for what meeting me might entail, and she showed no resistance. I assigned her management of the tribal women and instructed her to teach them the human language. When she and Suan left, I returned to my skeleton components. The camp was growing. I was beginning to enjoy the company. A month after the camp was enclosed and officially named, Suong approached me with information she had been holding in memory since childhood. An ancient battlefield, perhaps 20 kilometers northeast, where the spirit cat people had once fought a desperate engagement against a retreating Federation army. Many had died. The tribe had never fully recovered. That battlefield, she told me carefully, was where her people's strength had been buried. I left at sunset with a full escort and arrived after dark. What my necromantic sight revealed stopped me momentarily. Beneath the overgrown earth lay hundreds of bones from the same period, the same conflict frozen in mineral memory. 250 years of accumulated history, waiting. The excavation ran through the night. What I recovered changed everything. Among the ordinary remains were bones that were fundamentally different. Skeleton warriors and sorcerers of the spirit cat people, their bones still carrying faint traces of the extraordinary runes that had once been carved into living flesh. And human bones as well. Knights and mages who had fought and died in that same battle, their remains carrying the echoes of breathing techniques and combat skills that had been presumed lost for generations. I worked through the following days in a state of focused excitement, assembling and reviving each extraordinary skeleton in turn. Every revival was harder than ordinary resurrection, requiring concentration that left me pale and trembling. And every completion sent waves of time energy back through me that accelerated my own development dramatically. The spirit cat warrior that rose first wore bone armor built for agility, equipped with retractable triple-bladed claws and a short crossbow, its forehead bearing a spirit rune more complete than any Suong had inherited through her living lineage. The warrior carried knowledge that her tribe had lost, combat forms and rune patterns that had been severed by the disaster of that long-ago battle. Sun, communicating with the skeleton warrior through mental speech, recorded everything. Then I revived a spirit cat sorcerer, who proved even harder to bring back, requiring the full strength of a senior mage apprentice, which I had only just become. When it finally stood, the time fountain surged through me so powerfully that my depleted magic restored itself almost immediately. The sorcerer carried the engraving technique for inheritance runes. With it, Suong and her people could reclaim what had been lost. I watched Suong's face when she understood what I had done. She reached for my hand before thinking better of it, then didn't stop herself. "Thank you, Lord Mediv," she said, very quietly. I told her to go share the inheritance with the others and let me get back to work. Time passed in the way it does when you're building something you believe in, too quickly and not quickly enough simultaneously. The camp formalized into a proper settlement. The walls rose. The grid of blocks filled in. What had been a cleared ruin became a layered defensive structure of interlocking fortress buildings, aerial corridors, reinforced gatehouse passages, and underground storage that grew deeper with every passing week. I formally named the settlement Kurd. The plan was methodical, a 9-square grid centered on the city district with water reservoirs to the east and west, farmland in the north and corners, a livestock area to the south, workshop zones flanking the core, and a burial ground that would serve not merely as a cemetery, but as a long-term investment. Every body that entered Kurd's burial district would be treated, stored carefully at controlled depth, and left to accumulate the weight of years. What was useless today would become extraordinary material in a generation. I had been an archaeologist before. I understood in my bones the value of patient accumulation. Outside the walls, the Odyssey region descended into the chaos of famine following the bloodthirsty mosquito swarm. Enormous insects with beast bloodlines that swept through the region in a gray tide, stripping everything alive and leaving skeletal remains in their wake. The disaster drove herbivores into panicked migration, starved bandit groups into desperate alliance, and sent the entire fragile ecology of the region into a period of violent reorganization. Inside Kurd, we were almost entirely unaffected. The skeletons, having no blood to drain, simply hunted the mosquitoes in return, absorbing the beast-infused blood as a cultivation resource. A herd of enormous horned cattle monsters seeking refuge from the swarm ended up sheltering near the camp walls, and after a brief negotiation conducted through Suin's mental speech and one demonstration of what refusing my terms looked like, their leader agreed to a protection arrangement that would provide periodic blood donations in exchange for safety and high-quality grass. Sustainable development was always the priority. You don't slaughter resources. You cultivate them. The skeleton assassins I had deployed to scout the surrounding wilderness returned with information about a minotaur tribe in the mountains to the south. Minotaurs value their dead. They bury them in ancestral tombs, maintain proper grave sites, and accumulate the remains of generations in one place. This made them, from my perspective, a significant resource deposit. More practically, they had already sent raiding parties toward Kurd twice. They were a threat that would only escalate as I grew more visible. The operation I planned was not a frontal assault. Skeleton assassins spent a week conducting small provocations against the tribe's outer guards, luring warriors progressively further from the village center and keeping their chieftain's attention fragmented and hostile. The final phase involved stolen eggs from a nearby monster nest, strategically dropped on the chieftain at the precise moment that nest's owner came looking for them. The resulting battle between the Minotaur chieftain and an enraged second-tier wind beast destroyed most of the tribe's fighting strength, without costing me a single extraordinary skeleton. By the time the chieftain killed the beast, exhausted and broken, Kurd's forces had already emptied the ancestral tomb and were halfway home. He died without understanding what had actually happened. 16,000 Minotaur bones filled the underground warehouse, including specimens over 300 years old, some over 500, and one that my spiritual perception identified as 756 years old, glowing deep purple, almost certainly the tribe's founding ancestor. From the extraordinary remains, I eventually raised Minotaur skeleton warriors and skeleton shamans whose totem magic transformed everything. The shaman totems proved to be the most strategically significant development yet. Healing totems that sustained skeletons under continuous attack. Defense totems that made heavy armor effectively impenetrable. Taunt totems that locked enemies in place against their will, pulling them back into combat every time they try to break free. Rally and Wind Fury totems that accelerated the entire force. A Minotaur chieftain using these totems had killed a second-tier monster with his tribal warriors. My skeleton warriors were considerably more durable than flesh-and-blood Minotaurs. The combination was something else entirely. Wester had not forgotten about me. I learned this through prisoners taken after the Bloodraven mercenary group's first assault. A squad led by a capable knight called White Crow, who had arrived at Kurd with full confidence in his ability to take a necromancer's camp by force. The trap I set, open gates, retreating skeletons, and a carefully prepared welcome inside the walls, ended that confidence fairly quickly. The taunt totem locked White Crow in place. 6 skeleton shamans took turns maintaining control while the extraordinary skeletons methodically wore him down. He was a high-level first-tier knight with real experience and genuine strength. He still lost. The Night Crow, a skilled assassin and the group's deputy leader, beautiful and lethal in equal measure, had drunk an invisibility potion and gotten further into the castle than almost anyone else could have. The flame skeleton mage detected her through mental probing and forced her into visibility with a fire ring. She fought with everything she had when exposed, showing the particular courage of someone who has accepted the outcome and decided to make it costly. I admired it. It changed nothing. When Audrey asked what to do with her, I made the only rational decision. Trust earned through shared history was a resource I could afford to use. Trust offered by a prisoner after defeat was not one I could safely extend. The Night Crow was skilled, but she had not been shaped by the same crucible. There was no foundation on which to build. From the prisoners, I learned that Wester had been paying the Blood Raven for months, had, in fact, prepared his assassination attempt before I had even finished packing my things in Lawrence City. I stored the information with the same care I gave to bones that needed more time underground before they'd be useful. The Blood Raven group's captain, a low-level second-tier knight and one of the strongest fighters in the Odyssey region, arrived some weeks later with the remainder of his forces and his personal fortune packed for the move. He had looked at Kurd from a distance and decided he wanted it for himself. He was at least more careful than White Crow had been. He didn't charge blindly through the gates. He circled, reconnoitered, chose his attack point methodically. The workshop district, with its lower walls, and split his forces into 3 simultaneous assault groups. The skeleton archers were waiting. What followed was a systematic dismantling of a force that had entered the fight already convinced it would win. The archer fire suppressed the assault. The Blood Crow, watching his men die faster than he could advance, finally committed himself personally, which was when the taunt totem found him. He was a second-tier knight. He had killed extraordinary beings before with his own hands. He spent his final minutes fighting as hard as he had ever fought in his life, against skeletons that healed faster than he could damage them, supported by shamans he couldn't reach, surrounded by warriors he couldn't break through. He begged to surrender. He offered contracts. He invoked his strength, his experience, his reputation. No response. The Blood Raven mercenary group ceased to exist inside Kurd's walls. Among the equipment they had brought was a quantity of high-quality wheat seeds, purchased in advance, in anticipation of setting up farms once they'd taken the city. I accepted this contribution to Kurd's agricultural development with appropriate gratitude, assigned a skeleton farming team to prepare the fields, and returned to the tower. The seasons turned. Kurd expanded outward in the systematic pattern I had designed. Workshop zones and water reservoirs and livestock areas and farmland, all enclosed progressively in higher walls, all connected underground through tunnel networks for troop movement, all feeding into the central city district that now held a castle with 7 stories above ground and 3 levels below. The skeleton population passed 1,000, then 2,000. The extraordinary skeletons numbered in the dozens, then past 100. Each one a unique product of historical excavation and patient revival. Spirit cat warriors and sorcerers with their ancestral runes restored. Minotaur skeleton warriors and shamans with their full totem inheritance. Human skeleton knights carrying the flame and earth-breathing techniques of their previous lives. Skeleton mages teaching me spells one by one as their knowledge was recovered from the marrow of the past.